Good evening and welcome to Mental Health Mondays. So glad you're able to join us for yet another installment. I'm Pastor Trevor Phillips, along here with Dr. Dana Harley. We're coming today sponsored by Saving Grace Community Church and Grace House of Cincinnati, a nonprofit and ministry of Saving Grace Community Church. So, Dr. Harley, today we are going to dive in on our topic today, caring for children in crisis. I think when a parent or any parent would testify that when they have a child, they may go through their mind what possibly could be wrong or develop as they go along in life. But I think very few ever looked at something physical would manifest itself in a child's life, or they would succumb to some type of physical illness. But I think also most parents, if you were to ask them, would say that they would never think or imagine that, particularly under the age of 12 and maybe under the age of 17, that they would ever be faced with some type of psychological disorder. But in fact, out of the 74 million children and adolescents in the United States, over 17 million children have had or have a psychological disorder. And so when we look at a child, being in crisis, because for me as a parent, I remember my children were young, anytime they were not running around, getting in trouble, and me having to tell them to sit down or leave that alone, or they were laying around listless or something from some type of virus or something, that was a crisis for me. So, but for someone, especially whose child is dealing with some type of emotional stress or trauma, I think that it takes it up another notch. So when you look at crisis, Dr. Harley, because some children just have a problem. So what is the difference between a child, dealing with a crisis as opposed to dealing with a problem?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question in regards to the difference between a crisis and a problem. And so I think we can start with, all children sometimes display behaviors that we as parents might think are a problem. So whether a younger child, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, even 5-year-old may be having a tantrum, that could be identified as a problem for the parent to have to manage.
Okay.
But we have to first look at what is developmentally appropriate for that child's age. So we always look at it in context of the child's age and sort of what's in normal limits. Now, granted, each child is different and unique in their own ways. So a parent knows kind of what those differences are and what those things might be. But when we look at what might be more of a problem, if a parent is sort of tracking behaviors, we want to look at the frequency that the behavior is happening. So sometimes that tells us what may or may not be within normal limits. And we look at the child's age and where they are developmentally. So if we have an 8-year-old who's having temper tantrums similar to a 4-year-old, and these tantrums are lasting for longer than an hour, they're happening multiple times a day, they're interfering with the child at home, in a school setting, in social settings, then we would say that's probably more of a problem.
So more of a problem and not a need for call the super nanny, right?
Well, you may want to look at some of what's contributing to the problem. Sometimes we call those precipitating events. So
Okay.
sometimes we want to look at what is happening, what triggers are involved before the behavior occurs. But we sort of know based on research and based on observations of children that an 8-year-old tends to have more capacity to manage their behaviors or to manage things that they don't like or to manage their feelings. And Again, if an 8-year-old is sort of acting out like a 4-year-old, then we know that that's not typically within normal limits.
Okay. Okay. So we know that if it's not age appropriate behavior, and it lasts for over a period that's an acceptable time, then
Hmm.
perhaps there is it's went from being a problem to something a little more deeper.
Right, exactly.
What does it look like for a child to be in crisis, to be in a crisis?
Yeah. So when we think about crisis, again, we sort of look at the child's age. We look at, what's acceptable, or what's again within normal limits that a child may be able to handle. And so we're expecting an older child, like an 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 12-year-old, to be able to manage those feelings a little bit better. And so when we think about a crisis, we're looking at things that may be potentially causing self-harm. So if a child is banging their head on a wall or the floor, or if a child is making threats, if a child is saying things like, I don't want to live, or I'm going to kill myself, or if a child has a knife, or if a child runs out into the middle of the street. So there are different behaviors that we would look for, and say, yes, this child is intending to inflict some kind of self-harm. So if there's any self-harm at all involved, that kind of gives us the clues that we need to get that child additional help.
So when a child is not safe or poses a threat to himself or others, then we can deduce accurately that that child is in crisis.
Yes. So at that moment, that child is in crisis and they would need specific behavioral help to get through something like that, if the parent is not able to intervene and help that child to calm down. Now if the child does calm down and they're no longer a physical threat to themselves, that's still a really good indication that we need to follow up and still get that child help, and maybe get an assessment to sort of understand, what was sort of underlying that behavior, and are there things that that child may need assistance with.
So there are some triggers. Are there some standard things that are standard situations, circumstances that are common to every child across the board that may precipitate
Mhm.
a crisis, or is there some things more common issues?
Yeah. Well, I would say when we're talking about outbursts that are within normal limits. So for a younger child, a 3 or 4-year-old, no is a trigger. Telling a child no, like that, telling them no in the grocery store in the checkout line when
Hmm.
they're reaching for stuff, like
Hmm.
that's going to probably cause a little bit of a meltdown.
Okay.
Now, if you go out to the car, buckle your child in their safety seat, and you get home and they're still melting down, and an hour later they're still melting down, then we start to kind of look at that in terms of how long is the meltdown lasting. So we pay attention to the amount of time that the child is actively displaying that particular behavior, and how long it takes them to settle down
Mhm.
after they have been upset or had an outburst.
Okay. Well, I know that one of the say outlying illnesses may fall, or you can correct me, fall in type of mood behavior disorders. Would you designate those as things that are prevalent in children who are in a prolonged crisis mode, or having a type of prolonged event?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that first part that you said.
Oh, how
I'm sorry.
I'll rephrase it another way. How do mood behavior disorders affect children in crisis, and how much is that as a cause for children in crisis?
Got it. So, when we're looking at crisis and specifically for children who may have a mood disorder,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to see sometimes some similar behaviors in terms of what the child is experiencing. So, and different children will have different symptoms.
Okay.
And again, if a child is in crisis, part of what we're going to look for is this child at risk for self-harm? Are they at risk for harming someone else? Are there dangerous behaviors that we need to address? Is the child safe? So we're always looking at safety first. If the child is not safe, that's when we take additional steps. For younger kids, like, is the child biting? Like, are they biting other children? And so in that case, it may seem like, well, all kids bite or whatever. But we definitely know that if a child is biting, that behavior is saying something about what's going on with that child. So we don't know if that child doesn't feel safe, if that child feels threatened, but that's certainly an indication that we need to intervene and see what's behind that behavior. For an older child, if an older child is isolating, if an older child is not engaging in activities that they've engaged in the past, if they've started to lack interest in spending time with their friends and family, like, those are also red flags, in that it may not be a situation where the child is not safe, but it's a situation that needs attention also.
Okay.
And we also know, go ahead.
You get.
Okay, we also know that, again, we're trying to assess what's within normal limits. So an older child, a teenager, it's normal for them to want to be by themselves at times. It's normal for them to want to be in their room and listen to music or hang out with their friends and spend less time with their parents. So they're going through a self-identity phase of life. They're starting to think about other things. They want to be accepted by their peers. So they're in this whole sort of different stage. But as a parent, we can kind of think about, has my child really been isolating? Have they withdrawn from the usual social interaction that we are used to?
Okay. Well, that's critical, because sometimes, children are masters of the art of manipulation. So, and they might get upset, and you don't want to dismiss behavior or dismiss statements, but at the same time, you don't want to always calling crisis unit when something is displayed.
Right. Exactly.
Because I don't know how many children that I've seen, I've talked to, and I talk to parents, and they say, my child's got upset the other day and says, I'm gonna kill myself, and then they explore it a little bit. It's because they gave that shocking statement as a way of fighting back to the parent and saying, I'll show you. Now I've got you shaking, now what's up? And so I think that it's challenging at times, Dr. Holly, for many parents whose children can play on their parents' emotions, to not want to take a chance, but at the same time, not overreact. What advice would you give a parent in helping them look in terms of that behavior, determining if it's safe? And because, like you said, it's different for each child, it's different for each age group. But as a parent yourself, what advice would you give someone?
Yeah. So when I work with families and parents and their children, I take every threat at face value. I do not recommend that, if a child is in my office and they tell me they're going to leave and kill themselves or kill somebody else or cause some type of self-injury, my first clinical duty is to make sure that client is safe. Make sure that they're safe and get them help. And so when parents say, well, they made 7 threats last week and didn't do anything, Well, we don't know when one of those threats might be the real deal and might be a time when that child has been pushed to the limit and might actually cause self harm.
Okay,
So I prefer to act on every threat
gotcha.
and to process and to work with that child through that threat. So yeah, we don't know. And so even if they've done it 100 times, you don't know if a 101 is going to be that time. And so, us being open and having honest conversation and just trying to help understand what the child is going through, not using our judgment, not saying that, oh, you said that 100 times last week or whatever, or I'm not going to listen because I know that you're just trying to make me feel a certain way. And if we can just keep in mind that these behaviors are a reflection of what's going on with the child internally.
Hmm.
And so if we can get them to talk and to process with us or a therapist or someone that the child trusts, that can hopefully reduce some of the threats because then the child feels heard.
Well, so basically, what you're saying is better to be safe than sorry.
Absolutely.
I think the challenge that many of us in the adult world forget are that our children are our little me's. That
Mm-hmm.
they are. It used to be it used to be this show where they would say kids are people too. And I think that we fail to realize that we fail to understand that they encounter and have to deal with some of the same things, and
Mm-hmm.
some of the same things we
Absolutely.
are as adults. And we're oftentimes dismissive because
Mm-hmm.
we'll say you're just being a kid or whatever. As I said earlier, no parent really looks for their child developing any type of mental illness or being diagnosed with some type of
Right.
some kind of disorder, behavioral disorder. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, when we have what's the first thing parents do when they have a child, right? They count all the fingers, okay,
Yeah.
count
Yeah.
all the toes, or makes it making sure the child
Mm-hmm.
can hear them and so forth and so on. But it's
Yeah.
oftentimes that the mental and emotional piece doesn't surface till past toddler age. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times, it's difficult to distinguish what's a behavioral problem and what's within normal limits for a younger child. And so, if a parent has a 2 or 3 year old, or let's just say they have a 3 year old, and are like, this child is out of control, or these terrible threes or terrible twos or whatever, that's just kind of part of being 2 or 3. And
Hmm.
so we're looking to see if these same behaviors continue
Hmm.
through older childhood. So are you 5, 6, 7, and you're having the same tantrums that you had when you were 3? So that would be cause for some exploring with maybe a behavior health person or practitioner to be able to say, hey, this has been going on.
Hmm.
Little Johnny hasn't been able to control
Hmm.
his behavior, or his anger is, out of control, or he's throwing things, or he's destroying things. And again, those behaviors tell a story. And so we want somebody to help us understand the story that the child is telling us about their behavior.
So, because as you said, it's difficult at times to differentiate what's normal and what's not normal. And so, for the parent that's struggling to say if this person just is this a tension tantrum,
Mhm.
if him hitting the wall, if it's him not getting his way because I told him not to stomp his feet, he would get to hit the wall. Um, at what point, what type of care? Because the immediate reaction for many parents will be, "You better go sit down somewhere,
Mhm.
or you are going to get this taken away from you. You're going not
Yeah.
going to watch TV. You're not going to have this, and so forth and so on." But what would you say? What type of care? What type of advice would you give to a parent who has a child that's definitely in crisis mode or dealing with something, or
Mhm.
has just received a diagnosis um, that their child has a mental illness.
Yeah, and I think the first thing is, I would applaud that parent. I would applaud them for getting help. So many times we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect parents, and we don't want to seek help. So getting help is a huge step. So I would applaud any parent that addresses the behavior that's a problem and gets help. And then, secondly, just like if your child gets a broken arm, or if they have some type of physical health problem and need to go to Children's Hospital and work with the doctors and nurses and OT and PT afterwards, that's the same thing for the behavioral health.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the earlier that we can intervene and work with a child that's experiencing a behavioral health problem, then the sooner that we may be able to see a difference, to see a change, and then to help the parent with assisting their child with a behavioral health problem.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, what type of support? Are there some support agency, a support group, or that if your child has received a diagnosis of having some type of behavioral disorder, or uh, because that can effectively mess with the parent in terms of, did I do a good job? Was it my nutrition
Mhm.
that led
Mhm.
to this problem? Was it the environment in which they started to grow up in? Um,
Gotcha.
so what's there for the parent who has this child has received this diagnosis, who is overwhelmed and wondering, now how do I give care to this child?
Yeah. Um, and I think part of this process when the parents will take the child in to be assessed, to meet with a therapist or the psychiatrist and the behavioral health team, is that um, you're going to get an understanding of what your child's disorder looks like. And you're going to know what your child's symptoms look like. So you're going to get some education around how to deal with those symptoms. And I think it's important for parents to understand the disorder in terms of symptoms and not, my child and ADHD and my child got ADHD. I mean, it's
Right,
just like,
right,
okay, we
right.
get that. But we want to separate the disorder from the child, in that, yes, your child is dealing with symptoms of ADHD.
Okay.
And that we can still fight against those symptoms together.
Mhm,
We can fight against this together and
mhm.
still win. But when you fall into the trap of, I'm going to blame myself for all of this, I didn't feed my child a completely organic diet, I gave them too much Kool-Aid. I mean, like when you're just kind of just
Right.
going through all these things and all this inappropriate guilt,
Mhm,
and then when you're also looking at the child. And so we also don't want to blame our children for having symptoms of a behavioral health disorder. I think sometimes parents can fall into that trap. Like, oh, they're just being bad. Like,
right, right.
why are they just being bad? And we have to shift from kind of like, why are you doing that, or why are you like what behavior, looking at the problem behavior and asking why, instead of asking what happened. what has I noticed that you came in the house and you slammed the garage door. You seemed upset,
Mhm,
so I'm wondering what happened,
mhm.
as opposed to, I know you didn't slam my door.
Taking your shoe and throwing
And
it.
that's
Right,
probably your first reaction, is
right,
to correct the behavior.
right,
But
right.
when working with a child that does have a behavioral health disorder, it's important for us to take a step back
Mhm, mhm,
and say, I'm addressing the behavior,
mhm,
and I need to take my time and walk through it with my child so I can understand what precipitating event happened, what triggered it, and then maybe we can work through it. But if we're acting out of anger,
right,
and we're wanting to correct a behavior before we can get an understanding. Now, granted, if it's safety and the child isn't safe, there isn't time for the correction or whatever.
mm-hmm.
But if the child is safe and if your house is not burning down or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
maybe take a minute to understand what that behavior was about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know it's a different way of thinking.
That's a great way of thinking.
And it's a challenge,
mm-hmm.
but sometimes we can address the issues. We can help our child work through whatever that issue might be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it's an acknowledgement, that this may be, it may be a part of who they are, but it's not really a deficit. It's an opportunity for you as a parent
right
to further
right
have hands-on involvement in the development.
Absolutely. And I, as a parent, I acknowledge that my child has feelings. Like, kids are allowed to have feelings.
Right.
And I think sometimes culturally,
right,
we're raised in families or settings where you don't have any feelings, you don't have any rights.
Right.
You do not talk about, we don't care what you think.
Right.
And which is unfortunate, because that's how we learn how to share our feelings. Like, if we can share them in a safe way, if we can share them without being yelled at, if we can share them without judgment, and if somebody is there to walk through and process with us.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at depression or, child being like bipolar disorder or ADHD, how much is that related to genetics from the parents of the child?
Yeah. Great question. A lot of times we will see that there's a family history of behavioral health issues or problems. And so whether or not it was diagnosed doesn't really matter. But a lot of times, as you're going through your assessment with your behavioral health practitioner, they will ask you about a family history. And you might say, oh, yeah, such and such, has something going on, or yeah, his daddy is crazy or whatever,
Right.
And so, and what is crazy and what does crazy look like, so we can understand the symptoms. And so part of our jobs as a therapist is to understand what your definition of crazy looks like. So we know, that person was impulsive, or, that person had some mood stuff going on, or, that person was really anxious. So we want to understand what the symptoms and the disorder looks like. But there's certainly a family history. There's definitely a predisposition for individuals who have a family history of mental health problems to also potentially be at higher risk for developing a mental health problem, just like high blood pressure or diabetes, breast cancer. I mean, all these things is very similar.
So if I know and I share with during the intake, where folks in my family, maybe myself as a parent, have had the same type issues. Help me to understand how a parent who was diagnosed with a mental disorder or behavioral disorder as a child grew up without the care. How may that transfer into their child, them not having the care? How would that affect their parenting? If when they were a child, they didn't get the care they needed because they were in crisis or because they had some things going on.
Yeah. So for a parent who may have had some behavioral health issues and didn't get the same care, they may have heard that you are bad, like you're just bad, like you're a bad kid. And so when you internalize that you're a bad kid, and then you see yourself in your child, you may think the same thing. Well, now I have a bad child. And you may not be able to see the fact that actually I had some behavioral health stuff going on. Like, that was just kind of not within normal limits, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
now my child is displaying behaviors that are not within normal limits. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can think differently about our child's experience and say, I recall being my child's age and
Mm-hmm.
having these same problems. And I wish
Mm-hmm.
somebody would have helped me.
Right.
My parent or a teacher or just somebody just made a referral to say, hey, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I think such and such could use a person to talk to. And
Mm-hmm.
so we can give our kids
Mm-hmm.
something that we may have felt like that we didn't get.
Right, right. Because I think it's critical because even when as men, let's just say men who have
Mhm.
grown up in homes where love wasn't verbalized from themselves, which is another topic, to the child, that was just kind of how things were. And
Mhm.
if if a if a parent who has a child now who's been diagnosed with a disorder um, had the same disorder and they displayed those symptoms but didn't have um, the type of care they needed, then the way they're interacting with their child may be disingenuous and even harmful. The
Mhm.
question's been asked: does going through puberty trigger the onset of behavior-based disorder? Does puberty
Uh,
that?
that's a really good question. And I'll say there are a couple of things in puberty that we have to watch out for.
Hmm.
So, and I'll start with girls.
Okay.
So we tend to see mood stuff, uh, depression and other things happen with girls right around puberty because you have a shift in hormones. You
Okay.
have a lot of bodily changes. And when
Hmm.
you think about puberty from different, from a boy and a girl, so when a girl goes through puberty, like what is that looked at it like, there's shame and you
Hmm.
don't really want to go through this, like you definitely don't want to come on your cycle at school. I mean, there's all these things that you're trying to make sure it doesn't happen. But if you're a boy and you're going through puberty, and you're getting muscles and a mustache, like is that looked at differently than a girl?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
boys tend to have a more positive experience going through puberty because I mean you're getting taller, all this stuff is happening.
Getting
But
on
if
their
you're a
knees.
girl, yes. But if you're a girl and you're taller than all the boys,
Hmm.
your hips and stuff are changing. Like that's not always the best thing at that moment, you know.
Right.
So we tend to see that girls during the years of puberty, they do tend to have more mood disorders that are diagnosed as opposed to boys. And then also, if you think about how girls and boys process, so girls tend to internalize things in their processing and thinking. So, for example, a girl can have a fight at first bell at school with somebody.
Mhm.
By lunchtime, everybody in the whole school knows about it because girls just can't like they cannot get past it. Like they're gonna tell everybody, they're
Right.
gonna text everybody, they're
Yeah.
gonna call everybody, and by the time the school is over, like it's a really huge deal. Like
Right.
everybody knows.
Right.
Like
Right.
two boys can fight in second period at gym, and they fight and it's over.
Right.
Like nobody's
Right.
like, and so girls they think about that. Like they ruminate is what we call it. They think about it over and over and over and over. And so boys tend to externalize, like you get it out physically, like you fought or you went to play basketball, and it's a physical outlet, and you can move on. And
Mhm.
there is no internal going over and over and over and over and over.
And
So
rehab.
that's just a little bit of the difference, right?
Oh man. Well, I want to thank you, and one more question, but I think I know the answer that the parents today, in terms of these times of pandemic, in terms of coordinating services, what would be their option? Would it be virtual, or in closing, how would a parent, um, you know, what,
Yeah. So right now, I know a lot of therapists do offer virtual, and then some, I think, offer the in person therapy. So It would depend on the comfort level of you and your child and what you all would want in terms of, but both are available.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I do hope and trust that you received some valuable information for those parents that are there, in which you have children that may be in crisis or that may have been diagnosed with having a um, behavioral disorder. Hopefully, you realize tonight that there is hope, and with the proper intervention, your child can be well on to wholeness and wellness. As always, thank you, Dr. Dana Harley, for being with us tonight and your great insight and transparency. And to our viewers, we want to say, as we always do, it's our desire that you would feel better, that you would become better, and that you would live better. Until next week, may you have a blessed week and a great night. Good night, everybody.